name is Christopher Natsuume, and I'm the creative director and co-founder of a studio called Boomzap Entertainment. We're a casual game developer. We make video games. This is the fourth part of a 5-part series on how to run virtual businesses. Now, Boomzap is a virtual business. We've been a virtual business for 15 years now. We've been very successful at it. And I wanted to put this video series together just to let people know, here's how we've been running our studio. And certainly in these kind of weird, troubled times when a lot of people are having to work from home, maybe these are helpful tips for you. So I wanted to give all that information out as I could. The first 3 videos of this series, I talked about why you might want to run a video or run a studio the way we're running it. There's a lot of reasons that aren't pandemic related that this is a good idea. The second one is all about the reasons that people tell you can't do this and some answers to that. And then the third one, which is quite detailed, is a lot of processes and how we run the studio from sort of a production pipeline and, you know, how do we do this and how do we hire and how do we get people into this. So those are all great videos. I hope you find good stuff in those. This video, we're going to talk specifically about some of the tools that we use. Now, I was thinking about actually opening up a bunch of these tools and showing you, like, this is how we use it. And this is, the problem is because a lot of the work that we do is with publishing partners, a lot of this is under NDA. So I can't like open up my Slack channel and show you what's going on in the Slack channel because we talk about stuff in the Slack channel you can't know about. So I hope I'm going to talk about, and also quite honestly, the video will get very long if I did that. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of this stuff at a high level. I hope you don't mind just looking at my ugly face while I do this. If anyone has any more technical questions, there's going to be a comment section below. Please ask more technical questions there, and I'll get into details, etc. And actually, a number of people on my team who know some of this stuff better than I do, like how to use Slack bots and that sort of thing, have all kinds of information as well. So I'm just going to kind of give you a very high level without opening up the tools. The big tools that we use in our studio, Slack, Basecamp, the Google suite of tools, Dropbox, Trello, SVN. Those are the big 6. That's sort of, if you're in your first day at work at Boomzap, the first thing we ask you to do is to install all of that and, you know, set it all up the way that we work. That's what it, you know, if you were to show up at a normal brick and mortar studio, they would show you to your desk and here's your computer and they would get you started. Your first day at Boomzap, we actually have a Google Wiki site that we put together where we say, look, here's how to set up your computer in the way that we expect people to work in our studio. So let's start with a big one, which is Slack. For us, being in the office means being on Slack. Now, Slack is a great tool, and we've been very happy with it. I'm actually very, very happy with all the different things you can do with Slack. It's a great program, great company. It's not the only one, and there are other tools that I'm sure that you could use, but we've tested a bunch, and we've looked at a bunch, and we haven't found any that we like better than Slack. We worked for a long time on other tools. We used HipChat for quite a while. I don't even know if HipChat still exists or not, but that was, for a long time we used HipChat. And before that, we actually used MSN Messenger back in the early days of our studio because that was one of the only great messaging tools back in 2005. So we've been through a couple of these tools. By far, Slack has been the best of them. There may be a better one coming out later, but that's what we use. I want to tell you a couple specific tips about how we use Slack and how we communicate in Slack. Number one, everybody in our studio belongs to at least 3 key groups in Slack, right? And if you think of it, it's like dividing the studio on 3 different axes, right? The first axis is, what project are you in? Our studio runs multiple projects. We have a strategy game that we're working on. We have a hidden object game that we're working on, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to be assigned to one of those projects. And so that's going to be your sort of home base. And this doesn't just mean one channel. We have found over time having multiple channels for a single project is very useful. And I'll explain why. We have, for instance, let's take our strategy game. We're working on a strategy game called Last Regiment. It's in early access in Steam if you want to go look at it, by the way. We have a number of different kinds of people working on that particular project. We have artists working on art. We have designers working on designs. We have designers working on campaigns. We have programmers working on code. And as you go through communication on the Last Regiment project, you may have 2 people at noon that are starting a conversation about improving the user interface in the project. and they're in a relatively in-depth conversation. And somewhere halfway through that conversation, two completely unrelated people want to have a conversation about one of our campaign levels. Or maybe four other people in the project are in the middle of testing the game and they want to throw out a bunch of information about how they're testing. And to have that information come and show up, right? I just burped in the middle of this video. I'm going to leave that in because I think that's verisimilitude to see me burp in the middle of this. So back to the point. At some given point, there may be three different people working on the same project that want to have conversations about what's important to them right now. And to have them all multi-threaded in the same conversation becomes very irritating and confusing. Especially, as I talked about in earlier videos, there is the asynchronous part of somebody else might come in later and want to backtrack that conversation and know what was talked about. And for them to have to pick out each one of the bits of that conversation from multiple threads, it's quite irritating, right? So we have, for instance, and again, you don't have to do it exactly like we do it. And in fact, different projects have developed different channels based on the way that those projects like to work. In the Last Regiment project, for instance, we have, I'll check on Slack, it's right in front of me. We have the main hex channel, which is we talk, main Last Regiment issues. And I'll talk in a second about the whole hex part. We actually call that project hex internally, and I'll talk about why in a minute. We have a main hex channel. We have a hex art channel. We have a hex campaign channel where we talk about the campaign missions. We have a hex testing channel because we test the heck out of that game every day because it's a strategy game. We have to test it a lot. So when we're in the middle of a strategy game, that's where we put our notes. We have a hex code channel. And so each one of those different places is the kind of conversations we tend to have about that project. And so each time somebody wants to have one of those conversations, we put it in that channel. So if you're interested in today, what did we talk about in the brain stopped working. If today you're asking, well, what happened in the campaign missions? What got talked about there? You can go to the campaign channel and you can back read all of that. And that's very useful to you. So that's axis 1. Now, axis 2 is a discipline axis, which is what do you do at the studio? Are you a designer? Are you a coder? Are you a programmer? I mean, whatever you do in the studio. In Boomzap, we have a design production channel. We have a code channel. We have a business channel. We have a marketing channel. We have an art and animation channel. And each one of those channels, we have a sound channel as well. Each one of those channels is about company-wide issues relating to that thing. For instance, we use an engine that we built ourselves. It's a C++ engine to write all of our code. And that engine is used across multiple projects. So we may have two coders in the project who are both interested in some aspect of the code that's used on multiple projects. And so when you've got a sort of meta issue, something that goes across all of our projects, you take it to that channel and you have that discussion in that channel. So that way, maybe if I'm not working on Last Regiment, maybe if I'm working on Hidden Conspiracy, which is our hidden object game, maybe if I don't want to constantly have to think about what's happening in the hex channels, in the Last Regiment channels, but I do want to know that somebody just changed a bunch of code, which is going to change the user interface for all of our games, then that's something I might want to know about in the code channel, and I can go back read that in the code channel. So those channels get used a little less often. They're a little less chatty, but if you're a coder working on Last Regiment, you're going to be in all the Last Regiment channels, and you're also going to be in the meta channel of Boomzap code. Now the third channel is actually, or the third axis, I should say, is where are you in time and space, right? For instance, we have about a little more than a third of our studio in Metro Manila. And people in Metro Manila have issues that come up in Metro Manila. They want to know about how to get to the bank or blah, blah, blah. There's all kinds of sort of social issues that happen in their region that they might be interested in. And that's a place for them to go share those issues. It might be the case that the people in Metro Manila want to have a big conversation, for instance, right now about how to get your quarantine cards to move around Metro Manila. That's not particularly interesting to the people that we have in Indonesia, and they don't really want to be bothered by that. But that might be important to the people in the Philippines. So we have a channel for every country that we work in. So we have a Malaysia channel and a Philippines channel, etc. That one gets a lot less use than the others, but that axis is also important. Also, as part of that axis, we have a couple fun channels. Off-topic channels. One is, post your lolcats here and whatnot. But we also have an industry channel, which is where people post news articles about the industry that we think is interesting information that we should share about new games that came out or that sort of thing. Since this disease started, we actually started a COVID-19 channel. And that's actually where people are posting information and sharing information about how they're dealing with this disease and that sort of thing. So those kind of channels pop up every now and then. So that's the basics of the structure of our Slack. Now, the way that we use the Slack, and I talked about this at a great deal in one of our earlier videos, is being in our office means that you are on Slack and you are available, which means if I at somebody channel, and any one of these messaging things has a poke. If I poke you on one of the channels, I expect you to show up at that channel, answer that question in that channel within a minute or two, because it's working hours and you're supposed to be here and able to answer questions. So if it's between the hours of 10 and 5 and I go to the Hex campaign channel and ask Patrick, one of the people who's working on our strategy game campaigns, a question with @Patrick, I expect Patrick to answer within a couple minutes. And that's the heart of how we communicate, how we work, how we interact in the studio. This is a very critical part of our studio. Now, because of that, we are pretty serious about don't tag people you don't need to tag. Don't use the @here tag. Don't use the @everyone tag. That's @everyone is like you just got on the intercom in the studio and everybody stop what you're doing. Like I use that basically on payday to let everyone know they got paid, or if there's some huge information that the studio needs to know. The @everyone almost never gets used, right? And one of the things that we actually tell people, you don't want to be distracted all the time by Slack. So the first thing we tell people to do when they install Slack is turn off all notifications unless you are tagged. So if I say @Alan, that should pop up a little message @Alan, and Alan's like, oh, okay, somebody wants to talk to me personally, not just somebody on my channel, but me personally. If somebody's just posting something on the channel, I shouldn't get a pop-up, I shouldn't get a notification, I shouldn't get anything. The only thing that should happen is over on Slack, it gives me that little red number, or that little highlight of the channel that tells me, hey, there's some new information in that channel. And if somebody tagged me, there'll be a little number that says somebody tagged me and wanted me to do something in that channel, and I probably got a notification for that. But unless they tagged me, I don't want this to be notifications. And this is across the whole suite of everything we do. The last thing I want is people to be constantly distracted by crap popping up on their screen. All the notifications, everything's turned off unless you are specifically tagged. That's a critical part of the way that we work. What else can I say about Slack? That's most of it. That's most of how we use Slack. The other big sort of thing about Slack is Slack, and one of the reasons we like it, is it has a lot of really nice tools for you to use. When we conference and talk to each other, we usually do that in Slack. We don't usually go to Zoom or some other thing. And pointedly, we never use a camera. I don't really care what my staff looks like. I don't really need to see their face. That's not important. For most of our calls, we just do voice calls. And we do those voice calls in the main channels. And this is actually quite important. It is kind of against the rules at Boomzap to have meaningful conversations in private messages. We don't encourage that at all. And this, I mean, if you want to go talk about your girlfriend or whatever in a private message, go to. You want to say that Chris is a jerk and you hate him, go do that in a private message. I know, but it's better there. But if you're going to talk about something about the game, this is a feature that we need, this is something that needs to change, I want you to do that. We have a whole bunch of channels. There's a channel that's appropriate. Go do that in that channel. And the reason why I want you to go do that in that channel is I want you to do that where everyone else can see it and other people can respond. You may think that only these three people care about what you're talking about, but there may be somebody else in the project who knows something, has some information, has a good opinion, and they can come in and get involved in that. One of the reasons I have as many channels as I do is so that there is an appropriate channel for you to have a conversation about something on the project without derailing somebody else and without putting yourself in a private message. Now, the thing I was getting to is because we do that, when you want to have a phone call with somebody, you do that in the Slack channel that conversation would be meaningful for. So let's say I'm talking to Patrick and I say, Patrick, you and I need to have a call with Javi and Rox about the campaign levels. I'm gonna open that right there in that Slack channel. I'm gonna start a call in that Slack channel, and the three of us are gonna have a conversation in that Slack channel. And then when we're done, I'm gonna post a little message in that Slack channel. Hey, this is what we just talked about. Now it's 5 hours later, and Adrian wants to know what the heck's going on in campaigns, and he's reading through and he says, "Oh, look, these guys had a phone call at 4 o'clock about this. And here's the conversation that led up to that phone call. And then after that phone call, here's the little summary of what they decided in that phone call." That's really informative to him. And if you didn't get enough information about that, because he knows that this phone call happened, he could talk to anyone in that phone call and say, hey, Javi, what did you guys talk about? Did you solve this issue? And that information is there, right? Where it wouldn't be if I had set that phone call in, say, a private message somewhere or started another message for that. And so if you look through our Slack channels, you always see conversation, boom, voice call, boom, conversation. That's very, very important. The other thing is, like I say, we don't look at each other's faces in those conversations. I'm not pretty and I don't want to look at my staff. What we do is we screen share a lot. And this is our whiteboard. This is how we interact a lot of times. So for instance, I'm testing a game and I'm like, oh, I just don't really like how this plays. I'll get in one of those calls, I'll open up that screen share, and we'll all be watching Chris play the game. And I'll say, look, see this thing? This is not good here. Can we fix this? And because Slack has these wonderful little draw on the screen tools, my designers and artists and stuff, they'll draw circles and arrows and, hey, maybe we could put this thing over here and blah, blah, blah. That's actually very helpful. It's a great tool that Slack has, and we use the heck out of it. Another thing that we use is we use a lot of bots. And we have bots, and I could do a whole call on the different bots that we use. There's a lot of integrations that you can put into Slack. We use Trello, and I'll talk about Trello in a minute. We integrate Trello into Slack so that when cards change, Slack gets notified that cards change, and that's a nice way for people to know that people are working on stuff automatically, etc. One of the other very simple bots that we use is I have what's called the absent bot. And basically every time you type the word absent in a message, there's another chat log or another Slack channel called Who's Here Right Now, right? And every time I said, Chris is going to be absent for 2 hours, it takes that message and sticks it over into Who's Here Right Now. And so if I log on and I want to know, like, where is everybody right now? Everyone who's gone out to the dentist office or whatever, doesn't matter what channel they set it in, it's all going to be put in the Who's Here Right Now channel. And so I can see, oh, look, Javi's at lunch and MJ's out walking his dog and Bless is taking care of her grandma. Okay, they'll be back. And in that message, we always say, like, you have to put your name and how long you're going to be gone. So Bless would have put a little message that says, Bless is absent for until 2 o'clock, taking care of grandma. So now I can look in the Who's Here channel and boom, it's kind of like a little time clock where I can say, oh, okay, I can, and we don't track this. I don't care that Bless is gone 2 hours. What's important is I need to talk to Bless about something and I need to know, when can I do that? Oh, I can do that at 2 o'clock when she gets back from this, whatever. And so that's a really useful little bot that we use in Slack. I could go on and on about bots, but there's a bunch of different integrations and Slack is really great with that. I want to talk about another tool that we use. Probably the second most important tool that we use in the studio is Google Docs. I don't know what you call the whole suite, I guess the Google suite, but specifically we use a lot of Google Slides and we use a lot of Google Spreadsheets. The big reason we use these is because they're collaborative and you can get multiple people working on them at the same time. We put a lot of our data here. One thing, and I was talking before about, I interchangeably call Last Regiment Hex. Every project that we do gets a 3-letter code, right? And the code doesn't matter. Hex got called Hex because it's a game with a lot of hexes in it. We have a game that we're working on, a brand new hidden object game that we're working on called HO1, Hidden Object 1. Doesn't matter. And we do this for 2 reasons. One, I don't know what this project's going to be named. Games always change names in process. And you don't want to be in the position where you've got a bunch of files internally that are called like Last Regiment main menu, and then the game's not called Last Regiment anymore. Hex is going to be Hex until we ship. That code always works. And we've got a lot of assets in the studio that move around between projects and such. So we know, oh, this is a Hex asset. It helps us in the documentation, because every time I put together any document for Last Regiment, the first thing I put in the document name is the 3-letter code Hex. So if I'm looking for, where's the design document for Hex, where's the whatever, I can just open up Google and look in my Google Drive and type in HEX, and boom, here's all the documents for Hex. If I type in HO1, boom, here's all the documents for Hidden Object 1. And we're very, very fierce about that. Anything you do for that project must have that 3-digit code at the beginning, because now I can search for that stuff very, very quickly. The other thing that we do is there's 2 basic documents that we have for every project. One is what I call the Uber sheet, and one is the Google slide doc. The Google Slide doc this is the design doc for the game. Any project that you put together has a main design doc. Our design docs, they're in Google Slides. They're not in Google Documents. And I do this specifically because I have found pictures work better, that people look at pictures. It's very visual. It's very quick and easy to understand what things are. People don't read design documents. And in fact, I'll tell you a quick story. When I used to work at brick and mortar studios in a former life when I worked in big AAA projects and whatnot, we used to make these big, 200-page design Bibles and whatnot. And I got suspicious that nobody was reading them. And so I started putting a line in every one of these documents that said, if you read this sentence, I will pay you $5, come to my desk. Something like that. And in all of the time that I wrote those documents, I never had a single person ever ask for their $5. Not one ever. And so I realized not very quickly, actually, I realized over time that this was a waste of time. I was writing all this. It was a complete waste of time. But I do find that people look at bullet lists, people look at pictures. And so our design documents are very visual. Here's a screenshot of the game. Here's a bunch of little call out arrows that tells me what happens if I click on these things. Very straightforward, very easy to read. You can read through one of our design documents in 5 or 10 minutes, and you got a pretty good idea how the game works. The next sort of level of design is to go to the Uber sheet. And the Uber sheet is a Google spreadsheet with different tabs based on different information that we have in the game that you might need to know. Here's a list of all the units. Here's a list of all the sounds that we need. Here's a list of whatever. Whenever we're putting together that kind of data, it goes over in the Uber sheet. And everything gets its own tab on the Uber sheet. So instead of looking through 1,000 different documents, you can go to the Uber sheet and say, well, here's most of the stuff that you might need to know. When we put our strategy game together, here's a list of all the different units. Here's a list of all the different powers. Here's a list of all the different sounds that are going to be made when these powers and units. And interestingly enough, the only Microsoft document we still use is Microsoft Excel. That's the only piece of the Microsoft Office suite we still use. And we use that actually as part of our production process. A lot of the data that goes into our games is an export from a Google Excel sheet. And the only reason we still use Google Excel is because we like to use the versioning in it so that I can go back versions easily. And also it exports better to Lua files and things that we use in our game. But these Uber sheet documents, you can copy paste those straight into Excel, which is how a lot of our Excel sheets get built. Because one of the nice things about the Google Uber sheet is it's collaborative. So I can put together a Google Uber sheet that has all of the characters in it, and everyone can go in and edit that and mess around with it until we like it, and then somebody copies and pastes it into Excel, and then we spit that out, and that becomes a Lua file that becomes data in the game that the game is based off of. So we like these Google Doc sheets, or the Google Sheets. We like the Google spreadsheets. We use those a lot in the studio. I would say the Google Slides are also really important in our studio for brainstorming. A lot of times when we're trying to figure out how user interface works, or what a screen should look like, or something like that, we open up a Google spreadsheet in a desktop sharing during a Slack call, and we'll all together play around with that design and move boxes around and add things and stuff. And what's nice is when we're done with that, we have a design doc, right? This is what the screen goes to look like. And we all generated this together. It's actually a really powerful way to collaborate as a studio. So the Google Suite is a really important part of our development process. Third big tool that we use is Basecamp. And we don't use it nearly as much as you might imagine. I'm going to have a drink of tea here for a minute. We use it primarily as a historical record of things that got built in our studio. So when we start a project, let's say I'm going to make a new hidden object game, and I'm going to make 15 hidden object scenes. Each one of those hidden object scenes gets a to-do in Basecamp. And the to-do, we don't really care about it as like a thing that we check off as being done. In fact, we never ever check off our objects as being done, because that's not what it's for. We don't actually manage our tasks in Basecamp. What we're actually doing is that's a really nice place for us to have a series of threaded posts that clearly show here's what the first version of the character and the second version of the character and the third version of the character, fourth version of the character. And so when people, if you watch one of my earlier videos, you'll hear that I say that the artists always have to give us 2 works in progress a day. So what that actually means is the artist is going to take a screenshot of whatever it is they were working on, and they're going to post it in the appropriate to-do in Basecamp. So let's say they're working on a character and they've done the first line art for that character. Somewhere in Basecamp, there's a, and you can section your to-dos into to-do lists. So there's a to-do list of characters, and in that is, and those will be named by the 3-digit code of the project. So hex character 001, right? So hex character 001, I don't know, it's an orc. And so they go open up that to-do list. They post a picture of that line art, and then they put a link to that over in Slack, and they say, hey, this is what I did this morning. Now I can go look at that. Boom, there's a nice place for me to store that image, to look at that image. And importantly, that image is going to be there forever, because tomorrow she's going to do work in progress 2 and work in progress 3 and work in progress 4. And as this goes, there's going to be a historical record of here's how we got from the line art to the final art. And then later on, let's say another artist comes onto the project and she wants to know, how do I put this character together? Hey, I've got this wonderful resource. Look, Bless just did one of these characters. Here's how she went through it from line art to final art. Go take a look at that, right? And now we have this wonderful resource, this teaching resource in the studio of here's how we make stuff, right? And we've actually we've made videos and stuff out of that we've put online that have been kind of fun for the users of, here's how we make art and such like that. But for us internally, as a historical record of how did we get to the decision that we got to over time with these assets, this is a really, really powerful tool. It also, if at any given time, I want to know easily, where are we with our characters right now? I got 15 characters in this game. How far have we gotten with them? I can go to Basecamp. I can look, here's the to-do list full of characters. And one by one, I can select through the characters and say, oh, well, that one we've only got line art. That one we've only got this. And I have a record of who got it to that point. So I can very quickly figure out, oh, character 15, this dragon that we were making. Oh, it looks like Ejul was working on that dragon, and it looks like he only got this far. Now I can go to Ejul and say, hey, Ejul, well, what's up with this dragon? We need this tomorrow, and I see that we've only got the rough color wash of it. Oh, okay, let's get to work on that. So it's a very quick way for me to organize, here's where all of our assets are and the state that all of these assets are in. That's predominantly what we use Basecamp for. The other thing we actually use Basecamp for is they have a nice calendar. And so instead of using Google Calendar, which gets all involved with googly stuff, we actually use the Basecamp calendar, which is a nice calendar. But I mean, there's nothing special. It's just a calendar that people can use. Next big thing that we use Dropbox. This is basically a great big huge hard drive online that we all share. That's its purpose in life. And this is especially important in a virtual studio because I got people all around the world that need to easily get into our data and easily, grab assets and grab PSD files from other people, etc. And I need to make sure that if their computer got thrown into an ocean, not that much gets lost. And so the basic rule for Dropbox is whatever it is you're working on today, it gets uploaded to Dropbox at the end of the day every day. So if you're working on some piece of art, and Dropbox is really useful, especially for handling art and sound assets, because those are nice, big, chunky assets that they don't sit in SVN very well, because SVN doesn't like great, big, huge things like that. It's also important that we think of this as our sort of final repository for all of our assets. It may be 2 years after I ship a project and I'm like, oh man, didn't we do a user interface just like this? I want all those original PSD files. And if all those original PSD files are on some dude's hard drive who quit working for me a year and a half ago, I'm screwed, right? But if they are all properly indexed underneath those project files in that old project folder in Dropbox, it's very quick for me to go back and say, oh, here's all these PSD files. We can grab these, we can use these. And that happens a lot. So it's a really useful asset for that. A couple things about using Dropbox. One, for the love of baby sweet Jesus, use the client. I've seen people and they try to use the web version, and I guess you can, but keep in mind, a lot of our studio works in places that have crappy internet. And because we work in places that have crappy internet, I want to make sure that most of what they need on Dropbox is already on their machine. And we live in a time where, everyone on our staff just leaves their computer online. They leave their computer online all night. And if they've got stuff in the local client and they've set it in Dropbox to be local, it's going to quietly sit there and synchronize things all day, every day, so that when people put new stuff up, it's going to quietly get put into their hard drive and they don't have to do anything. And when it comes time for them to, go into our art reference library and pull out a whole bunch of art from our reference library, they don't have to wait for it to all download. It's already on their hard drive. Now, this does eat a lot of space on people's hard drives. Everyone on our studio's got to have a great big hard drive. But we live in a day of cheap hard drives, so it's not like that's a huge problem. One of the things you need to do with that, though, is, our Dropbox is huge. So you do need to use the smart synchronization tool in Dropbox. For those of you who don't know what that is, you can actually tell it what you want to synchronize and what you don't want to synchronize. And so, the sort of first thing you do when you start a day at Boomzap is you go and synchronize only the files that you need. So the files on your project, or maybe if you're an artist, the art reference library or something like that. So now I've got only the stuff that I need to keep synchronized, because otherwise you'll literally eat terabytes of hard drive and it's crazy. So use the smart synchronization, use local folders, and for God's sakes, use the client. Those are kind of the big three of Dropbox. Now, another thing about how we use Dropbox in our production process that's actually quite nice is what we call the build patch system. And this is not rocket science, but there is for every project. Let's talk about Last Regiment for a minute, which we'll call Hex because that's its name. So on the Hex project, there is a Hex folder. And in the Hex folder, there's a build folder and there's a patch folder. Now, the build folder is the build from last night. As I talked about in an earlier video, at the end of every day, somebody does a build. When the build is done, the build goes in that build folder, right? And that's all that's there, the build. That build is exactly the build of the game. And everyone on the team has that build folder synchronized on their local client, which means while I'm asleep in the middle of the night, my computer is happily downloading the build. When I wake up in the morning and I want to play the game, it's already there. I've already synchronized it. My computer already has it. The hard drive already has the build on it. Even if I have crazy slow internet and it takes, 3 hours to download the build, fine. It did it at 3 in the morning. It's there when I wake up. Now, once I have that build folder, I now have the game local on my machine and I can do my work and I can get done what I need to get done today. Now, as I go through the day, I'm going to be needing to add files to the build, right? I made new art. I made a new executable. I put some new sounds in the game. Whatever it is I did to the thing that I need to put in, there's a separate folder called patch. And that patch is slowly replicates the build structure of the build. So if there's a folder in build called sounds and I put a new sound in, I make a new sound folder in that patch folder and I put my sound in that. So at the end of the day, we take whatever's in that patch folder, lay it on top of the build and make a build, right? And at any given point in the day, as I'm working, I can go grab that patch and it won't just have the work that I did. It will have the work that anybody else added to the patch. So I may be working on sound all day, but Ben's working on animation and Ben added a bunch of animation and the files that he needs for his animation to the patch. And he says, hey, Chris, I need you to test this thing. Now, I don't have to go get a whole new build or anything like that. I just grab the patch folder, copy the patch folder on top of the build folder, which I already have because it got downloaded last night. And boom, I have the latest, best version of the game with all the stuff that Ben and anybody else in the project that put anything else in today has. Now I can play that version of the game, right? And it's a very straightforward way of working. It works very well. And we have a nice record of, at the end of the day, the programmer in charge of the project renames the patch file. The patch file actually has a folder called latest, and that's where we put everything. At the end of the day, he names that, May 17th or whatever the day is, right? And we have a whole record of May 16th, May 17th, May 15th, blah, 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 down the row of all the old patches. But I know what the latest patch is. I grabbed the stuff from the latest patch. So now there's always, here's the build from last night. Here's what we did today. Very straightforward. Every project has that. And it's very quick and easy to get going. And we use Dropbox for that. Next thing that we use in the studio, the next tool that we use Trello. And, for those of you who like the whole Kanban, Post-it note, whatever, blah, blah, blah. There's whole videos about that. Go watch all that. The short version of how we use Trello is we use it like that. And I don't want to get in a big lecture about that. Trello is a pretty simple, easy to use tool. I don't want to get into too much detail here. You know how Trello works. It's there's Post-it notes. You move them around. And this is how we track tasks. So, if I have 15 different animations that I need to get done, or I need to fix this UI or notes or whatever, each one of those gets added as a Trello. Usually that Trello has a link in it to a Google slide where there's a diagram of what we did, or the notes of what we did, like I talked about earlier. We'll just take a link from that slide and stick it in the Trello and say go do that. And you go look and you can see. If there's a piece of art that we're working with, there's a link to the Basecamp. So, I just told you that we have this big record of, hex character 001. That's going to be a Trello task, make hex character 001, and there's going to be a link there to Basecamp. So if the artist gets given that task, they click that link, boom, there they are. Now they know where to put their stuff. Done. Very straightforward, very simple. The next tool that we use is, and probably the last tool that I want to talk about, is SVN. We use this for source control for a number of different assets in our game. This is something our programmers use for source control of their programs. This is also what we use for source control for scripts and things like that. The only place that we use a Microsoft Office document anymore is we still use a lot of Microsoft Excel sheets. And I could give a whole lecture on how we build data. In a lot of studios, scripting is done with some kind of complicated scripting language or whatever. We build all of our scripting languages as Excel sheets. And that's a really nice organized way to look at data. All of our Excel sheets have a little export button that say, turn that into a Lua file, and boom, it'll export that and turn it into a Lua file, and that's what our games actually use. And our designers don't have to learn complex Lua scripting or anything like that. They just have to look at an Excel sheet. And the Excel sheet is always marked up with lots of comments for, this column is where, if you imagine, for instance, a strategy game, we have one tab in that Excel sheet, which is all of the units in the game, and here's how many hit points they have, and here's how many hit points damage they do, and here's what sound to use when you summon them, and blah blah blah. All that kind of stuff all gets put in a great big Excel sheet where it's very easy to manage and very easy to look at, with nice little notes in the columns where the designers can jump in and say, I don't know, where am I supposed to put the, blah, what goes right here, see in the column? And then when the designer's done playing around in that Excel sheet, which requires no scripting knowledge, they push the big export button, and all of that gets pumped out into a Lua sheet, and that's what the game actually reads as the data for the game. And we use SVN as the repository for that, because for that, I don't want you collaboratively editing it. Collaborating on that sheet would be a problem, because people are adding rows and deleting rows and stuff like that. And for a thing that's actually tied into a scripting language, that would be very problematic if I had 3 people in at the same time editing at the same time. You might delete a column that I'm in the middle of using or something like that. So that we actually want to put in source control. We let people check that in and check that out. And you know how to use source control. It's no magic, but that's what we use for source control in the studio. And that's it. That's our studio. Those are the tools that we use. The engine that we use is a in-house engine that we built ourselves. And of course we have all kind of tools and stuff for that, but that's very game specific. But in how to run a studio and what tools, people always ask me, what tools do you use? That's the tools we use. That's how we use them. Now, I will say one last thing. There are tools that we don't use. And the big tools that we don't use, we don't use much Microsoft Office at all. I mean, like I say, we use Excel for a very specific purpose. It's not actually how Excel is meant to be used, but we use it for that. I guess I also use Excel to do my finances, but that's about it. We never use Microsoft Office. Other than that, I haven't opened up a Microsoft doc other than something somebody sent me in 10 years, right? They're not compelling they're not compelling software compared to the Google Suite right now. Email. We never use email. I use email to talk to people outside of the studio and like my grandparents and stuff. Like email to me is a very old tool. It's a very bad way to communicate. Even when we communicate with our publishers, I try to get them off of email very quickly and get them into our Slack channels and into the way we work, because that's a much more reasonable, immediate way to talk. Every time I get into like a 5 email thread with somebody and I just think, oh my God, how do people even work? The minute people want to use email with me, I'm just like, okay, boomer, like whatever. No, don't use email. Skype. Oh my God, what a terrible project. Skype was a decent project once. Microsoft bought it and destroyed it. Don't use Skype. I use Skype because I have to interact with people that only use Skype, but seriously, don't use Skype. We don't really use Zoom very much because everything that we would want to do in Zoom, we can do in Slack, and it's tied to the rest of the stuff that we're doing in Slack, so it's better that way. I think some people think Zoom is a better chat program for face communications and whatnot. I'll be honest with you, we don't do a lot of face communication anyway because I don't think it's very useful, and I think a lot of people just don't want to be seen, to be honest. I don't particularly want to be seen. So I don't know that Zoom offers me a lot that I can't get out of Slack, and Slack offers it to me all threaded with the conversations in Slack. So we don't use Zoom or any other tool like that very often. We almost never use phones. That's not a thing. We don't talk to each other on the phone or anything like that. We don't use any kind of instant messaging that's not Slack. If you want to talk to me and you work for me, you're going to work on Slack. I won't talk to you in any other form of communication, quite honestly. And we don't use fax machines. And I know you think, why did you even mention that? Oh my God, people in Japan still use fax machines, and I don't understand it. And honestly, for me, using email or using a Microsoft Doc, that to me feels just as backwards and old as using a fax machine. And I will say, I do obviously have to use email because I communicate with people outside of the studio. So, their email is still a thing. When I do use email, I use Gmail. I don't use Microsoft, whatever, Outlook or whatever. I mean, seriously, if you find yourself tomorrow sitting down and opening up Outlook, you need to really ask some questions about your life and how quickly you've sort of modernized yourself, because you're very much living in 1990 something. Stop that. Whatever. If you're still using Microsoft Outlook, really stop that. That's not. Use Gmail. It's searchable. Set up labels. It's better. So that's it. That's my lecture on our tools and how we use tools in the studio. This is the fourth part of a 5-part series. If this is interesting, there will be a 5th part, which is where I'm going to talk specifically about how I work more productively and how I do things just on a personal level. I hope that will be useful to you. There's 3 videos before this where I talk all kinds of other stuff. There's links below and whatnot. Hopefully I'll figure out how to edit this video and put a link to the Discord, I don't know, here or somewhere. We'll figure that out. But we do have a Discord. You can ask me questions in Discord. You can ask questions in the comments. I hope this was helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next video. Freedom!